you pick up any newspaper in the state of Alabama in the last few days, you know the challenges facing our state on the budget front. We're looking at our 5th proration in the last 10 years in the Education Trust Fund. We're looking at our 1st proration in nearly 20 years in the General Fund. Even the Medicaid Fund, while there are stimulus dollars left over from last year that will continue for another year, the Medicaid Fund is under pressure. We've already heard announcements of cuts in the quality and degree of prescription drugs made available to our seniors in the state. As I travel around the state of Alabama, and I hear people talk about what's on their minds, many people say to me that they think state government is broken. They think that too much of what happens here in Montgomery is dominated by special interest groups, dominated by old ideas, and that we have an undying resistance to things that we didn't think of and that we didn't invent. Well, I want to talk for a few moments today about our budget crisis, and I want to talk about the path that I hope the Alabama legislature and our current governor will follow over the next several months. I'm hoping that this budget crisis, which is real, which is severe, and will affect families all around the state, has one silver lining. I hope that that silver lining is that it causes us to rethink in a fundamental way how we budget, and that we rethink in a fundamental way some of our priorities in state government. Several months ago, I stood in this very same place and I rolled out a taxpayer protection plan. We talked about over $600 million worth of savings that could be achieved in the state of Alabama without having to make cuts to essential services, without having to put those cuts on the backs of low-income or vulnerable people or our seniors. I outlined several months ago, and will repeat today, the need for Alabama to move toward a more aggressive focus on performance in our budgeting. The state of Texas in 1995 made a decision to launch an annual performance-based review. They decided they would look at every single state program and they would ask a threshold question: is it working? Is it delivering the services it purports to deliver? And how can we make it more efficient? Texas planned to do this for 1 year. It was so successful they continued it. Now it's an annual part of the budget process in Texas. And Texas in the last 15 budget years has saved $1.6 billion. The state of West Virginia in the early part of this decade made a decision to do a comprehensive performance review of state government. They spent about $500,000. There was a lot of criticism. There was a lot of money to spend on consultants to look at your budget and analyze it for you. They ended up saving $300 million, pretty good return on a $500,000 investment. The time has come for the state of Alabama to launch the kind of aggressive performance-based review of our budget that other states have implemented in the last several years. We also need to make specific changes in the way we budget. We're familiar with how we do things here in Alabama. We sometimes miss the fact that what we do in the budgetary front is very different. We're one of a few states in this country that has a year-in, year-out budget process. The legislature in the next few months and the governor will budget for the next fiscal year based on a 1-year estimate of tax revenues coming in. The last several years they've gotten it badly wrong, and that's contributed to the cycle of proration that we've had in the Education Trust Fund and has pushed us to proration now in the General Fund. We need to move toward having a rolling revenue scheme for the way we budget in this state. When we make a decision to budget, instead of making a year-in, year-out determination, we need to look at a 5-year period, perhaps at a minimum, perhaps as long as a 15-year period, so that we level out the good years and the bad years, so that we make an assessment when we budget that isn't based on guesstimates of what happens in the future, but safe, conservative estimates of what's happened in the past. Legislative Budget Office has estimated that if we had done this kind of rolling budgeting instead of single-year budgeting in the last 15 years, there would not have been a single instance of proration in the Education Trust Fund. Not a single instance instead of the 5 we've had, and that the Education Trust Fund would have grown at a solid clip between 5% and 7% every year. That's a reform that we can undertake now. And it's a reform that will help us begin to master the process of having reasonable, prudent budgeting here in the state of Alabama. Third of all, we need to give the governor a meaningful line item veto. Some of you may read somewhere that Alabama has a line item veto right now for a governor, but it's the weakest in the country. The legislature can override it with a simple majority vote. Now, by definition, what is a veto? It's a veto of a bill that a majority of the legislature just passed. If the legislature can turn around and override it with a majority vote, it's meaningless. In addition to that, as some of you know very well, the legislature can play games. And in effect, the legislature can come up with its budget too late in the session for the governor to exercise a line item veto, because there's a rule as to exactly when a governor can use it. I want to give a governor the ability to use a line item veto whenever the budget is passed, and I want to require a 2/3 supermajority to overrule it. If we do that, that will make the next governor of this state, in effect, the best watchdog we can have in the state of Alabama. The governor of this state will be charged with line item by line item going through the budget and making decisions about where to cut waste and where to cut possible areas of excessive spending or unnecessary spending. Right now, the governor doesn't have that practical authority. A meaningful line item veto would give him that authority. Other things that we need to do. As we talk about the way we budget in this state, we have to recognize that all of it is against the backdrop of a special interest group dominated political environment. As I've moved around the state, so many people have said to me, how are we going to break the grip of special interest influence in this state? I am the only candidate for governor who has laid out a comprehensive ethics plan. I would ban lobbyists from giving gifts of any sort to elected officials or to people who are appointed and who serve as part of the executive branch or legislative branch. I would put caps on campaign contributions. And I've also proposed, speaking of budgets, speaking of government spending, that legislators cannot use their discretionary funds as cash cows for their employers or their spouses' employers. Right now, occasionally legislators will get in trouble if they end up being too brazen about it. But there shouldn't even be a possibility of a legislator using his discretionary fund or her discretionary fund to sustain the interests of that person's employer or spouse's or family member's employer. We need conflict of interest rules that prevent legislators from coming to Montgomery and being lobbyists for the institutions who employ them. There's another point of reform that I want to make. As I have said many times in this campaign, we need a constitution for the second decade of the 21st century and not the first years of the 20th century. The 1901 Constitution that we have constrains our ability to budget. It constrains our ability to make all kinds of practical decisions in the state. And once again, the legislature, as it gathers in the next few days, will find important ways that its hands are tied by a document that is outmoded. We need constitutional reform, and I remain the only candidate for governor who has not only endorsed the idea of a new constitution, but has pledged to support a convention to make it happen. Short of it, ladies and gentlemen, is too much of what goes on in this city when it comes to state government is broken. And this is the consequence of it. Cuts are going to be made to our budget in the next several months that will impact families who are struggling. A few years ago, we had to cut free breast cancer screenings for low-income women. A few years ago, we had to cut free antivirals for low-income people who have AIDS or HIV positive. A few years ago, we had to cut out vaccinations for certain low-income children. Those are budgetary choices forced on our government because of weaknesses in our process and weaknesses in the way we do business in this state. I'm the one candidate runner for governor who has a set of plans to change it. It's the final comment that I want to make before I take your questions. I've laid out some specific ideas. Add them all together, what you have is a change in mindset. And all those changes together, and what you have is a different way of doing business, a way that will make us more accountable, a way that will make us more transparent. If just a few of these reforms are seriously considered by the Alabama legislature in the coming months, Alabama will run better. If all these reforms are implemented in the course of the next few years, our state government will function better than